Corinthians chapter 8, the first 15 verses, as we're working our way through 2 Corinthians in this series called The Plenty of Empty. I'll read this out loud and just ask for your initial responses to it. We want you to know, brothers and sisters, about the grace of God that has been granted to the churches of Macedonia. For during a severe ordeal of affliction, their abundant joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed into a wealth of generosity on their part. For as I can testify, they voluntarily gave according to their means and even beyond their means, begging us earnestly for the favor of partnering in this ministry to the saints, and not as we expected. Instead, they gave themselves first to the Lord, and by the will of God to us, so that we might urge Titus that as he had already made a beginning, so he should also complete this generous undertaking among you. Now as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in utmost eagerness, and in our love for you, so we want you to excel also in this generous undertaking. I do not say this as a command, but I am, by mentioning the eagerness of others, testing the genuineness of your love. For you know the generous act of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that by his poverty you might become rich. And in this matter, I am giving my opinion. It is beneficial for you who began last year, not only to do something, but even to desire to do something. Now finish doing it, so that your eagerness may be matched by completing it according to your means. For if the eagerness is there, the gift is acceptable according to what one has, not according to what one does not have. For I do not mean that there should be relief for others and hardship for you, but it is a question of equality between your present abundance and their need, so that their abundance may also supply your need, in order that there may be equality. As it is written, the one who had much did not have too much, and the one who had little did not have too little. Okay, so what stands out to you in that text? Art? Julie?
Yeah, given beyond and, that's,
Okay, yeah. The example of the Macedonian church is giving beyond their means. Yeah.
I was gonna say, it's a good reminder to be generous. I think sometimes you can become complacent even if you are generous. And so it's a reminder of how you should be.
Yeah, it really is it's a very stirring and rich reminder about the importance of generosity. What else stands out to you? Yeah.
well, coming up in verse 11 and 12, it's not, it makes no difference if you have a lot or if you have little. It's the desire to give. And that's what's important. Right.
So the text may provide an opportunity to reframe what we think is generous. Generous isn't X amount. It has more to do with the desire, the intent behind it. Okay. What else stands out to you in the text? Aaron?
Well, I'm wondering if any non-Jews would have gotten the Exodus reference.
At the end, this last statement, yeah. It is a nice connection back to the Exodus story and the provision of God, the provision of manna for his people. I certainly had to look it up. Kathy.
Yeah, I feel like I'm missing out because there must be a sense of Macedonia that I don't have. And because he's talking to the Corinthians about Macedonia. And that's always a tricky thing. If I came in here and I wanted Stanford to give a lot, what do I give? An example of somebody else that gave a lot? Am I doing that to, spur them, kind of shame them, not be one up them? Or, I just feel like that's for most of us, that would be a tricky thing to start to do.
Mhm.
And so then I'm wondering, well, maybe Macedonia is already not doing well compared to Corinth anyway.
Mhm.
And so, but still, it's still a tricky thing to say.
It is, it's a fine
Yeah.
line to walk.
Yeah, they're giving beyond their means. How about you? You know, I mean,
Yeah.
that's just a hard one.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it seems that the churches of Macedonia are probably referring to Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea,
Right,
like 16, 18, 19, and 20.
that we know of.
So, yeah, it'd be interesting to know what they know about those churches
Right.
and how this hits them.
Mhm.
Oh, well, churches of Macedonia.
Right.
Yes, Eva.
What is that for me also? How do I apply my generosity? And let me explain a little bit. My situation may be a little different personally because I have a lot of family in Poland.
Mhm.
Okay, and what they think of me, I am a millionaire.
Oh,
And for longest time, my son was basically milking this situation, and I would be sending money because I had, and he did it.
Hmm.
And the reason he didn't, because whatever he made was going to drinking.
Hmm.
So where do you start the generosity? How do you say, okay, no more?
Mhm.
Okay. So that's what it stand out for me, you know, I wanted to be generous. I wanted, and I would wanted to help. But is it helping or is it feeding something which is basically ruining his life?
Okay. Yeah. So sometimes the most generous thing may be to not give.
That's what I did.
Yeah. Right.
Basically
Yeah.
stop.
Yeah. Ye-
Yeah, and I learned something actually along the same line because we were somewhat in the same situations.
Mhm.
But I learned sometimes ago that you don't want to make someone your priority and allow yourself to be their option. So they're asking you, they're your priority, but when it comes to as they see you, you're just one of the options that they have.
Yeah.
So that's when I because my phone, like even said it was always ringing, there was always, and the need is great, and I sympathize. I understand because I live it, I've seen. But at the same time, you have to understand where to start, where to stop.
Mhm.
Because you are one of the options that you have, but you have your own obligations. So when it comes to generosity, you can be generous, but at the same time, we have certain other obligations. that you have to meet.
Yeah. So the more we sit with this, the idea of generosity, maybe the less black and white it gets, because it is complicated at times. Let's just look at the background to this text and the need that is motivating it. So this is number one on page 27 of the notes. But the overall background seems to be this crisis in Jerusalem, which existed for a number of different reasons. As one commentator provides six overlapping reasons why there was this humanitarian crisis going on. So one, many Jewish Christians may have migrated to Jerusalem to find fellow believers, and once there may have encountered exclusion and persecution, just in general, leaving a number of people in need. Two, resources being shared in the early church may have quickly run out. We have these inspiring examples in Acts 2 and Acts 4 of, everybody's just sharing all that they have and selling fields and all that they have. And there's probably a limit to that. That's how sustainable is that? And so it may be that initial flow of resources in the early church has started to trickle. And now there's greater needs. Three, there were widespread droughts and famines when Claudius was in power as emperor, AD 41 to 45. And just like today, these famines, these droughts would have impacted the poor. even more than the rich. And it was already expensive to live in a city like Jerusalem, large city, capital city. So the number of poor would have been high already. And then you add these droughts and famines that would have affected them. Those three. What happened to 4? I think 4 was when it's expensive to live in Jerusalem. 5, residents of Jerusalem were subject to smothering taxation. So again, a downside of living in Jerusalem. Civil taxes, religious taxes. 6, because the Jerusalem church was the mother church, it would have naturally drawn a number of itinerant teachers, pilgrims, travelers, all of whom would have required additional assistance. So probably a lot really going on in the city of Jerusalem that sort of creates this humanitarian crisis, which is exacerbated now by these droughts and these famines. And that's what Paul is striving to address here. So the largely Gentile church in Antioch has responded by sending relief with Saul and Barnabas. Acts 11. By the time Paul writes 1 Corinthians, he's already started canvassing aid from churches in Galatia. The Corinthians have heard about it. They've asked to be allowed to share in that ministry. 1 Corinthians 16. And now by the time 2 Corinthians is written, Paul's contacted the Macedonian churches who begged him for the favor of taking part in this. And now he's using their example to stimulate the Corinthians to carry out what they'd already shown an interest in. So that may soften a little bit this, hey, look at what these churches are doing. Now, how about you guys? The Corinthians have already demonstrated that they want to help. They've sort of started, but they're sort of, I don't know, maybe they've stalled out a bit here, which often happens, right? I mean, you hear of a need and there's this initial enthusiasm out, and it's sort of like Paul's having to come back to them and say, okay, the need is still great, and it's time to sort of finish what you guys started last year. Just look at the Macedonian churches, okay? They didn't stall out. It does seem that the overall theme of this text, these 15 verses, is the generosity of God, which is intended now to motivate the generosity of the church. The church has been the recipient of the generosity of God through Jesus Christ. And now, in turn, the church is to be generous toward the world in which it finds itself. So it's not just a social argument that Paul's making. Hey, look at these folks in need. It's a very spiritual argument that Paul is making here. Hey, look at how generous God has been to you. He does call this a grace. Verse 1, we want you to know, brothers and sisters, about the grace of God that has been granted to these churches in Macedonia. A lot of times we think of that word grace as something like unmerited favor, a gift that God grants to someone irrespective of their merit. And so when Paul says, we want you to know, brothers and sisters, about the grace of God that's been granted to the churches of Macedonia, we might then be prepared to think about, God's given those churches some remarkable gift. God's given them millions of dollars, or surplus in their harvest. But it's interesting how he describes the grace, right? Verse 2. So the grace is for during a severe ordeal of affliction. What? That doesn't sound very gracious. Their abundant joy and extreme poverty, that doesn't sound very gracious, have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. So Paul is calling their ability to give in the midst of difficult circumstances a grace, right? An ability granted them by God. An ability granted them by God. Have you ever given in a way or seen someone give in a way that you would say, oh wow, that could only be from God? Because that seems unreasonable.
say all the time.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's exclusive to just one action. I think it is grace of God. And so regardless. What it is.
I can think of an antithesis of that. And, I shouldn't be too judgmental, but I grew up in a church that had a very notoriously wealthy member who had the habit of giving financial resources regularly. And that was about it. I mean, he gave money and he was acknowledged for being generous, but I don't know if he really was that generous with the whole of his life. And I think this whole passage speaks to generosity as being a worldview, not necessarily a circumstantial view. You know, we're not just generous when we have things to give. We're generous because it's the view we have of the world and not where I am right now.
Yeah, I think I find this text really challenging because I think one of the implications is that Paul's, as much as he stresses this language of giving according to your means, he's also pressing this word grace here. Look at these churches, look at how they're giving. That kind of giving could only exist if God is the one that made it possible, because it exceeds what seems humanly possible. And as much as he then sort of caveats that with, you know, give according to your means, not according to what you don't have, that idea still is hanging out here, that there is a kind of giving that is so generous that it exceeds what seems like is humanly possible, and it can only be called a grace from God, a gift from God. Does that make sense? Julie and then Aaron.
It's awful that it's coming to Paul that there's this meeting, you know, some people here have talked about, like, is it really, you know, and it's very awful when somebody you really have confidence and trust that they express it as a serious meeting. You know, I'm more likely to give when there's somebody that I truly trust is telling me that it's necessary. And so I'm more willing, you know, and when I'm trying to figure out, is this, you know, am I hurting someone by helping? Is this the right thing to do? So that just helps me do the things.
Yeah. And certainly that could be another reason why he brings up the Macedonian churches, that to lend credibility to the Jerusalem project. Hey, you're familiar with the Macedonian churches. They recognize the need as well. You know, nobody here is trying to pull the wool over your eyes. This is a big deal. And I mean, what was happening in Jerusalem probably was a bigger deal than we may really be aware of. I mean, it seems like it was a very significant humanitarian crisis. Aaron.
This kind of reminds me of Jesus's parable about the rich man and the widow. You know, the widow giving out of her, you know, the rich man just, you know, gives this big amount to make sure everybody knows. And the widow just kind of drops her 2 mites in the box and is done. And who had greater honor? And I think he's sort of referencing that kind of thing, having not heard that parable, but kind of parallel.
Sure. Yeah. The same truth seems to be communicated.
They gave out of their lack.
That's right. Yeah. Out of their poverty here. So this grace of giving comes in the midst of a severe ordeal of affliction. These churches in Macedonia, as they were given birth, they were accompanied by opposition to the apostles planting them and to new converts. We see this in Acts 16. Their abundant joy and their extreme poverty, that's an interesting dichotomy there. And that's, you know, in the series we're looking at places of tension in 2 Corinthians, and this is this is one of them. How can abundant joy exist in the presence of extreme poverty?
That's the best.
Actually, I'm not surprised. I can say I've seen. I've seen the best in people in the worst of time.
Hmm.
One of which in the week of 9/11, and the other was after the earthquake in Haiti. I can tell you my whole life, these were the time I've seen the very, very best in people. In terms of the in terms of the willingness to share when they have very need, or the willingness to give hope, to encourage people to have to be hopeful when they're in the midst of a man-made disaster. I think, no, that's not us. That's the exception. And you see that in there was, while I was at 9/11, Bill Clinton and one of the other actors was right next, was walking by people. Nobody was like, oh, it was like, oh, that's just everybody was saying that. Yeah, it was probably, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was just like, oh, yeah. What they do, yeah, very next.
So when things are at their lowest, sometimes we often see people at their highest, at their best. Yeah, so extreme poverty and abundant joy. Here, Robert.
Yeah.
Kind of piggyback on he I was watching the news how I heard how there's so many people that when they're at their lowest were generous with their time and their efforts to help others, and even in a heroic way. There's basically said in so many words on the news. One reporter said there's more heroes than can be counted. So many.
Yeah.
It's Hawaii situation. Yeah.
Oh, in Hawaii. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. That's a good. Yeah. Scott.
Well, probably the beginning of generosity is when we give up on this very American idea that lack of poverty equals joy. This is not true. Not true.
Right. Yeah. So it's a reframing of joy for sure, and the source of joy. It's not tied to possessions or abundance in any capacity here. Eva.
Very quickly. Throughout my life, my financial situation was all over the chart. There was time I had absolutely no money. There was time I had a little money. There was time I had some money, but as God said, it never depended on the joy. And when I had no money, what I could contribute to be generous is my time. I volunteer all the time in some kind of charity to give my time if I couldn't give financial contribution. And that brought a lot of joy. And personally, the less money I had, the happier I was, because there was very little to worry about.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Just want to draw attention to that phrase, wealth of generosity in verse 2, which again is, just fraught with tension, because we tend to think of wealth as receiving. Wealth is, I become wealthy by receiving.
Yeah.
But here's the wealth of giving, the wealth of generosity. And what a great goal for the church to be. We want to be a wealthy church, wealthy in generosity. Okay, so then in verses 3 through 5, so I'm on number 10 on the handout, number 10 on page 29. In verses 3 through 5, Paul essentially describes what this wealth of generosity looks like. For as I can testify, they voluntarily gave according to their means and even beyond their means, begging us earnestly for the favor of partnering in this ministry to the saints, and not as we expected. Instead, they gave themselves first to the Lord, and by the will of God to us. So I see this as sort of like a laundry list of qualities of generous giving here. So, you might just think about your own sense of giving. How many of these boxes would you sort of tick off? So it was voluntary. It was voluntary. Verse 3. There's no external pressure applied to it. There was no hellfire brimstone applied to it. This was voluntary, and that seems to be really critical. If the church is about pressuring people to give, it's no longer voluntary, and therefore no longer a wealth of generosity. B, it was beyond their means. It was according to their means and even beyond their means, which again is a little bit of tension here. On one hand, it's according to their means, it's consistent with their own levels of socioeconomic status, but on the other hand, it was also beyond their means. It exceeded expectations there. And so that'd be another component of wealthy generosity, giving beyond their means. It was desired. It was desired in a number of ways here. So there was this passionate desire. They were begging. And who does that? Who begs to give? These churches were. They were begging Paul. They had this passionate desire to be part of what Paul was doing here. They asked for this favor of giving. Usually when we ask for a favor, we're asking somebody to do something for us, but here they are asking for the favor of doing something for someone else. So there was this desire, like Anna pointed out earlier. If it's giving solely out of obligation and duty, and that's what we do, then it's not wealthy generosity. So it's desired. D, there's this sense of partnership here. So they saw this as a partnering in ministry. They saw their act of giving as something that was part of a larger group of partners that were going to make a difference together. The word translated ministry in this translation is koinonia, fellowship. So the giving was an expression of fellowship, of communion with these other Christians. So there's something very relational about that. It's not just sort of writing a check and being done with it. They seem to care about the relationships that existed here. E, it was to the saints. So who's the target here? Who's this going to? Well, as they saw it, it was to the saints, to the holy ones, to God's people who are suffering in Jerusalem. So there's a very positive view of the people who are receiving this. And sometimes even in fundraising pleas, the target of the funds or the effort are sometimes painted not so positively. But here in this text, there's this recognition that, oh, look at who is receiving the gifts that we're giving. It's the saints, it's the holy ones, it's the people chosen by God. There's a sense of self-surrender, not as we expected. Instead, they gave themselves first to the Lord, and by the will of God to us. So what's motivating this giving? It's motivated way back here by this sort of self-surrender, giving of self to God. If I give myself to God, naturally at some point that's going to include what's in my wallet, what's in my bank account. Which of those qualities of giving do you find most inspiring, or most missing from your own giving, or most present in your own giving? Voluntary, beyond their means, desired, partnership, to the saints, self-surrender. Eva?
I think the volunteer is something which speaks to my personality. I really say something what I demanded to do, that there's a kind of mistrust of some charities which claim to be, that, but I think I am very generous to my church.
I try to be whatever that is I mean. And the partnership, that's basically what I think speaks to me.
Mhm.
That's I identify with.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Anyone else with any of those qualities which seems most inspiring to you or missing from your own sense of giving or really present in your own giving? Art?
I like the self-surrender.
Yeah.
I like the concept that it's, it's through the will of God that you give.
Mhm.
I really do.
Yeah. Thank you.
That's a good one.
Mhm.
I don't know where to throw this in, but apparently, among the Jews in the diaspora, they often sent money to Jerusalem for one thing. Jerusalem often had famines, often was poor, not just as temple tax or something, but they actually supported them. So then when you go outside that and you see, but now in the Christian community, Gentiles are now sending money to the Jewish people. And what that must have meant to the Jewish Christians
Mhm.
in to be supported by these Gentile people that, they didn't know what it meant. And I'm just wondering how common that was anyway. I mean, if Jews did it, yes, but I don't know of other groups that necessarily have that. Maybe they did, I don't know.
Mhm.
And if a lot of people are traveling with large amounts of money, how's this even work? I mean, it does
Yeah.
talk and acts about people. You have to trust the people that are taking the money because they're physically taking money.
Mhm.
And you have to trust that they can protect the money they're sending, because obviously highway robbery could be pretty lucrative,
Mhm.
or seaway robbery, or whatever where they're going, if people are carrying large amounts of cash or,
Mhm.
or coins or whatever you got, it's really sitting there. But one of the things I do like is the idea of the partnership, the feeling on both sides
Mhm.
that there's some equality in the end here.
Mhm.
That's what really gives me quality of emotion, reciprocal feelings towards each other. Sometimes when we give, we give, and that's good, but it goes to people we don't feel any connection to, or we don't get a connection back. You know what I mean? It just goes, and that's good. I'm all for that. But it seems like here they were looking for a more reciprocal link to link them together
Yeah.
in the future going forward.
Yeah, and certainly this is part of Paul's larger project for the unification of Jew and Gentile.
Mhm.
So this becomes a very practical expression of that. I think was Charles, your hand up?
Yeah, I was thinking about the passionate desire part. And it seems to me that the desire to give is there when you love who you're giving to. It comes from that. It's a relational quality,
Mhm.
but, it's sort of, I don't be too reductive about it, but, it's sort of like, people spend money on what they want, and people get time to what they want, it kind of plays out that way.
Mhm.
And if, I think, here especially, if I think about what was in their heart to love and to see the dance, they're gonna want to get. I think sometimes that question about, giving it's transactional, right? But it misses that quality of the heart.
Mhm. Yeah, and I mean, yeah, I think that's really helpful. I mean, what Paul's really shooting for is something that goes way beyond sense of duty and obligation. I mean, he's trying to connect to a deeper desire that's very relational here. Yeah.
That story about the rich young ruler, and that story most often hear it about the rich young man being challenged to get one of the sad, and the idea being, well, he just loves his money more than anything. I didn't want to give it away. But in that context, I think maybe the issue was that he didn't love the poor. If he loved the poor, he wouldn't have, he would have wanted. Yeah. right?
Yeah,
So I think. The question kind of gets to, what is it we really care about?
right, yeah, yeah. Josh,
Yeah, I just wanted, I think the idea of giving beyond your means is just, it feels very compelling. And to me, it seems to challenge to some extent this idea of an American theology of fiscal responsibility, in which giving is always has a privileged place, but also has a place that is bounded to some extent. Like when we think about including tithing, that's often thought of in a very structured way. But here, this desire to give there's a provision for that to push past those boundaries that we might even call unresponsible in a certain way. And there seems to be this community is being admired or glorified, despite what may be seen as in a sort of very plus and minus sense, and fiscally irresponsible decision in our modern context.
yeah, so there's something sort of countercultural here about that. Scott,
What motivates me most is how inspired someone who receives a gift will be. And I think there's nothing more powerful than for someone who is in need than someone giving to them. It's when it's aspirational, which is to say, it's not about the gift, it's about who I believe you can become. And I think that's the most powerful part of giving, is if you're giving to someone because you believe that they can be something better than what they are. That's to me really for them and for me.
Yeah, good. We're gonna stop there. We'll come back and finish up 8 and jump into 9 next Sunday. So I'm gonna stop sharing that screen. And I'm gonna stop recording.